He ran onto the stage. That's the first thing you need to understand. He didn't walk, he ran. The audience went insane before he even reached the desk. Jim Carrey bounded out from behind the curtain like a man half his age, arms wide open, face already doing three things simultaneously, eyebrows raised, mouth twisted into something between a grin and a grimace, eyes wild with the particular electricity that had made him the most recognizable face in comedy for 30 years. He pointed at people in the front row. He did a voice. He nearly knocked over a camera. The audience was on its feet before Stephen could even say his name. This was Jim Carrey being Jim Carrey. This was the performance that never stopped. The Ed Sullivan Theater was electric that Thursday night, the way it only gets when someone genuinely unpredictable walks through the curtain. Stephen met him at the desk with that warm smile, the two of them falling into easy banter immediately, Stephen deadpanning, Jim escalating, the audience feeding off every exchange like it was oxygen. For the first 10 minutes, everything was exactly what anyone watching expected it to be. Funny, relentlessly, exhaustingly, brilliantly funny. Jim was promoting a new project, a creative exhibition, paintings and sculpture, the kind of artistic pivot that surprised people who only knew him as the man with the rubber face. Stephen asked about the work, and Jim launched into a monologue about consciousness and ego and the illusion of identity that somehow made 300 people laugh while also making them think. That was the gift. That had always been the gift. You never saw the depth coming because the surface was too dazzling. Stephen waited for the right moment, then he asked the question that wasn't on any card. "Jim," he said, leaning forward slightly, setting his pen down. "After all these years of making everyone else laugh, what do you do when you need to laugh? Who makes Jim Carrey laugh?" It was meant to be a softball, a warm segue, the kind of question that opens a door to another 5 minutes of material. Jim smiled, the famous smile, wide and immediate. But it didn't hold. Something happened in the half-second after the smile appeared. It flickered, like a light with a loose connection. And then it was gone, replaced by something that no camera in 30 years of interviews had ever quite caught on Jim Carrey's face. Stillness. "I don't," Jim said quietly, "I never really learned how." The audience laughed, they assumed it was a setup, they waited for the punchline. It didn't come. Stephen didn't move. He recognized immediately, with the particular instinct of someone who has conducted thousands of interviews, that they had just stepped off the map. He stayed very still and said nothing, which was the only right answer. Jim looked at his hands for a moment. When he looked back up, his eyes were different. Not wet, not yet, just different. Older somehow than the man who had run through that curtain 4 minutes ago. "My dad," Jim said. "His name was Percy Carrey." He paused. "He was the funniest person I ever knew in my life, funnier than me, honestly. He could do voices, impressions, he had this timing that was just, it was natural, you know, it came from somewhere deep, and he spent his whole life being told it wasn't enough." Stephen nodded once, very slowly. He worked in a factory for 23 years. He wanted to be a musician, then an accountant, and neither one worked out, and eventually he stopped reaching. He took the job that was there, and I watched that happen. I watched him shrink into a life that was too small for him. Jim's voice was still controlled, still carrying that performer's precision, but something underneath it was beginning to shift. "And I was maybe 8, 9 years old, and I decided that my job, my actual job, before I had any idea what a job was to make him laugh. To remind him that he was funny, that he was more than what the world had decided he was worth." The studio was quieter now. The audience had settled completely, the laughter energy dissolved into something more attentive, more careful. "Did it work?" Stephen asked softly. Jim let out a short breath, not quite a laugh, not quite not a laugh. Sometimes I could get him. He had this laugh when it was real, when I actually got him, it was the best sound I ever heard, it was like proof of something, proof that he was still in there." Jim turned his coffee mug slowly on the desk surface. "But he was tired a lot and worried. When you're worried about money, when you're worried about whether you're enough, laughter is a luxury, and my dad couldn't always afford it." Stephen said nothing. The silence was not empty, it was full. "He got sick when I was starting to get some traction. Small stuff, commercials, stand-up, a few TV appearances, nothing big yet, but you could feel it building. And I kept thinking, just hold on, Dad, just hold on a little longer. Because I'm going to make it, and when I do, I'm going to make you laugh every single day. That was the plan, that was the whole plan." Jim stopped. The coffee mug stopped turning. "He died 8 months before In Living Color aired." Jim said it simply, without drama, the way people say true things they have said to themselves so many times that the sharp edges have worn smooth. 8 months, he never saw any of it, not one thing. Subscribe and leave a comment because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Stephen felt his throat tighten. Behind the cameras, a sound engineer had taken off his headphones and was sitting with his hands in his lap, just listening. "Jim," Stephen said, his voice careful and low, "how long have you been carrying that?" Jim looked at him. Something moved across his face, recognition maybe, that the question had found exactly the right place. "Every day," he said, "every single show, every premiere, every standing ovation, every time a crowd loses it for 1 second I look up." He gestured upward briefly, just a flicker of the hand. "Every time, still looking for him in the room." The studio was so quiet you could hear the stage lights humming. "I became the funniest man in the world," Jim continued, and there was no arrogance in it, only the flat weight of irony. "And the only person I ever needed to make laugh never got to see it, never got to know that his son made it, that the thing he passed down to me, that gift he couldn't use himself, it turned out to be worth something." Stephen stood up from his desk, quietly, without announcement, the way he had learned to do in moments that were bigger than format. He walked around to Jim's side, sat on the edge of the desk, and looked at him directly. "He knew," Stephen said. Jim looked up. "Parents always know," Stephen said. "Before the credits, before the billboards, before any of it, they know." The kid who stayed up making faces in the mirror, the kid who needed the whole room to be laughing, the kid who couldn't stand to see his father sad, your dad knew exactly who that kid was going to become. He raised him. Jim's jaw tightened, the muscles in his face doing the thing they had spent 60 years learning to do: hold, contain, perform. But this time they were losing. "He used to call me Tiger," Jim said, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. "When I was little, he'd say, 'Go get him, Tiger.' Every school play, every stupid talent show in the church basement. 'Go get him, Tiger.'" A pause. "I haven't heard that in 40 years, and sometimes right before I go on stage, right before the curtain, when it's dark and loud and I can feel the crowd, I hear it, I still hear it." The first tear came then. Jim didn't wipe it. He let it sit there on his face like he'd earned the right to it. Stephen didn't look away. He didn't reach for a tissue or signal to the producers or do any of the things that television trained him to do in uncomfortable moments. He just sat there on the edge of his desk and let Jim Carrey, the funniest man in the world, be sad in front of 300 people and a camera and all of America. Because some things are more important than keeping the show moving. "I never said thank you," Jim said finally. "I never told him that the reason I could walk into any room in the world and make it lighter, that came from him. That was his. I was just the one who got to use it." Stephen nodded slowly. "Then say it now," he said simply. Jim looked at the camera, not at the audience, not at Stephen, into the lens, past it, into whatever was on the other side of it. "Dad," his voice was steady, rough at the edges, but steady. "I got him, Tiger. I got every room, every single one, and every laugh that ever came out of any of them. That was yours. I was just holding it for you." The studio held its breath. Then from somewhere in the middle of the audience, one person started to clap. Slowly, not enthusiastically, reverently. And it spread not like an explosion but like a tide, row by row, until the whole room was on its feet and Jim Carrey was sitting at Stephen Colbert's desk with tears on his face and a smile that, for the first time all night, had nothing to do with performance. It was just a man who missed his father. Stephen looked out at the audience, then back at Jim. "You know what I think your dad would say right now," Stephen said. Jim shook his head slightly. Stephen smiled. "Go get him, Tiger." Jim laughed. A real one, sudden and unguarded, the kind that surprises the person laughing more than anyone else. He pressed his hand to his eyes, shaking his head, laughing and crying at the same time in that particular way that only happens when something has broken loose that needed to break loose for a very long time. The audience laughed with him, not because it was funny, because it was true, because they recognized it, that specific, helpless, overwhelmed laugh that has nothing to do with comedy and everything to do with love. Stephen let it breathe, then looked directly into the camera. "If you have someone in your life who taught you how to make the room lighter, tell them. Not later, not when the timing is right, right now, because Jim Carrey has made the whole world laugh for 30 years and the one laugh that would have meant everything, he never got to hear it. Don't let that be your story." The episode aired without a single edit, not one cut, not one softened moment, not 1 second of the silence removed. The response was unlike anything the show had received in years. Not because Jim Carrey had cried on television, plenty of celebrities had done that. But because for 17 minutes on a Thursday night, the funniest man alive had stopped being funny and in doing so had made people feel something that no joke ever could. His father's name was Percy. And somewhere in every room Jim Carrey has ever walked into since, Percy Carrey is still in the audience. Still laughing. Still proud.